You're listening to episode 89 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. If you are new to the show, welcome. If you've been with me for years, thanks for coming back. We have a great show today. Our topic, a new vision for healthy eating in 2021. My guest is registered dietitian nutritionist Maya Feller of Maya Feller Nutrition. She is a nationally recognized nutrition expert. She's author of the Southern Comfort Food Diabetes Cookbook, and she's adjunct professor at NYU. So Maya joins me today with approachable nutrition solutions and new perspectives on how all of us can eat a healthier diet during the pandemic and beyond. What you're not going to hear today are diet prescriptions or strict rules or even weight loss advice. Instead, together, we will look at nutrition through a slightly different lens. For starters, we're going to discuss how systemic racism drives inequities in healthcare, access to healthy foods, things we often take for granted, and health outcomes, and what we can all do to right that wrong and help to improve the health of all communities. Get ready to be empowered. We're also going to explain why there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach to healthy eating, and why a new emphasis on embracing and celebrating your cultural foodways, perhaps with a few modifications, can lead to better eating and better health. And if your family is like a lot of families out there where everyone has a different food preference and a different food priority, Maya explains how you can all still get one meal on the table that everybody will happily eat. She's going to make our lives easier. Before we dig in to a new vision for good nutrition for everyone in 2021, I have a few friendly reminders. If you love the show, tell a friend about it or post a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on lizshealthytable.com and be sure to check out the show notes from today's show for all the highlights. And if you want to engage more deeply with me and this podcast community, be sure to join the Liz's Podcast Posse page on Facebook. It is a closed group, but anybody can join. You can check out the show notes from today's show once again for a link to the Podcast Posse. And now, for my conversation with Maya Feller. Hey, Maya, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. Let's just get this started. Let's just jump right in. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself, where you live, and then we'll get into your website and what you do. And you've got some kids, so tell us about your kids and your family.
Yeah, so I'm based in Bedside, Brooklyn, and I live with my 2 children, my husband, our dog, and our 2 cats. And, like many of our neighbors, we are working from home and managing remote school, trying to keep the kids sane, hold it together ourselves, live in the gratitude of what we do have, and just keeping it honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough time for everybody. I know you've got 2 kids, so you're homeschooling. Is that right? They're not back in school?
So one of them is in hybrid. Let's see how long that lasts. And the other one is fully remote. So yeah. So, just kind of navigating what that's like. I mean, in fact, today my husband and I said, usually you say it's a win-win, and we're very positive people, but we're like, it's a lose-lose.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of it. It is really a challenge, Liz. I don't know what the right thing is, but just trying to keep the kids feeling safe, connected, taken care of, and like they can come out of this, cosmic shift kind of, not totally broken.
Right. Yeah. I have a 22-year-old, and a 25-year-old. It's a whole different world. And and I will say my 22-year-old did the worst he's ever done in college because he can't stand the remote thing. He wants to be in the classroom. So I can't imagine all these little kiddos, and what they're going through.
Yeah, my daughter fully canceled the pandemic. She, at the beginning, last March, she was like, no, I opt out of this.
You're like, oh, if it was only that easy.
Exactly.
So you're a registered dietitian. Tell everybody a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so my practice is really centered around non-communicable diseases. So helping people reduce their risk of developing them or working with people who have them. And probably I'd say, a few years back, I used to refer to them as the diet-related chronic illnesses, right? So we know them as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, overweight and obesity. But I actually stopped using that terminology and leaned much more into how the World Health Organization kind of quantifies it, because to say diet-related really puts the majority of the onus on the patient, right? You had a quote unquote bad diet, so this is why you have this condition. When in fact, it's, the reasons why people have these conditions are multifactorial. And so I refer to them as non-communicable, as I said, like the same way that the WHO does, simply because that's what they are, right? Nobody can get them from another person, right? You can't pass it on. So that's really the focus and the center of the work that I do. And I'd say from a lens of cultural humility and really like trying to deliver patient-centered care.
Right. And, it's interesting when, we take it for granted. We say, oh, diet-related illness. But what you're saying is there's so much that goes into it that if you say you have a diet-related illness, like the patient suddenly is like, I'm bad, I blew it. And it's not always like what you eat, or that's often part of it, but it's not the full picture, right?
That's exactly right. There's so many layers. When we think about socioeconomic status, when we think about proximity to grocery stores, when we think about access to grocery stores, when we think about how affordable actual foods are in a store, what's inexpensive versus what is more costly. If the person's receiving a food subsidy, what's covered under the subsidy. Think about health literacy, then we add literacy in. You think about safe housing. I mean, the list goes on and on. And then, of course, you have to add race onto all of this, right? And we know that in this country that people are living in different Americas, right? They're having different experiences. And we know that, Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color are absolutely having a markedly different experience in comparison to, our white counterparts when it comes to finances, when it comes to education, when it comes to safe spaces to move our bodies, when it comes to how we eat, what we eat, and then our health outcomes. So, those are the layers that really go into kind of the development and the frequency of developing those non-communicable diseases.
Right. And, and you and I just were talking about the pandemic. And when you think of the pandemic and the health outcomes or how people have fared, during the pandemic, if you went into this pandemic with high blood pressure or diabetes or suffering from obesity or not having access to healthy food, you did and are doing worse. And I think that's what you're getting at here. So as we look into the future, there's just so many changes that need to take place so that we all are healthy. If we're not healthy, if we don't have access to healthy food or like you said, places to move and get physical activity, we're just always going to be behind the eight ball. It just is. It's a huge issue.
It is probably the biggest issue, in my opinion. When we're thinking about systemic racism, structural inequities, there are all of these cycles that just perpetuate keeping, racial and ethnic minorities in disadvantaged spaces. And the truth is, just as you said, Liz, if you went into the COVID-19 pandemic with a diagnosis of diabetes or high blood pressure, well, yeah, when hospitals closed or primary care practices closed, like how are people supposed to manage their conditions, right? If they can't get access to their doctor. We already know that, Black people specifically are disadvantaged when it comes to receiving all of the care that's needed in comparison to our white counterparts. So yeah, we went in at a disadvantage, and we see when we're looking at all those lines of, cars waiting for food and people who are hungry. And I mean, we are not in a great moment. I'm hopeful that things will shift, but it's not a great moment. And it is definitely tough to be a person of color in this country right now.
I can remember years ago doing a story for CNN about, because I used to work at CNN as a producer and reporter, and we were covering a story on access to food, access to supermarkets. And we featured a woman, I think it was in the Bronx. She had to get in a cab and on 2 buses just to get to a supermarket, and then had to buy her groceries and schlep all the way back. But now she has to take a cab all the way back because she has all this food, and that's really expensive. And I think a lot of us take it for granted that we have the Whole Foods, the Stop and Shop, the Trader Joe's, the farmer's market. We have all of this at a stone's throw from where we live, or we have a car. And so I think a big part of it, and maybe you can comment on it, is just we have to have access to healthy, safe, and affordable food. Everybody has to have access to that. Otherwise, we can't even how do you tell people to eat a healthy diet if they can't even get to the supermarket?
That's absolutely right, Liz. And then one of the things, that I've seen, especially in my research and when I'm writing, is when we think about kind of these areas of where grocery stores are, and then we break it down along race and class lines, you see that neighborhoods where Black and brown people live have been redlined, meaning that grocery stores are not there. Right? It's like they've moved out because they don't value the neighborhood they don't value it. And then what moves in is these dollar stores and the corner bodegas in urban centers. And then in rural areas, there's just no grocery store, right? It's like we're talking about 10 miles or more to get there. And so in urban settings where Black and brown people are living, you see that the dollar stores are selling this abundance of overly processed foods, right? We're talking about tons of added sugars, tons of added salt, tons of added fats, synthetics through the roof. It's, packaged goods that are meant to last for 15 years on the shelf without degrading. And if that's what people are eating, when we talk about pro-inflammatory foods, well, that is the definition of a pro-inflammatory food right there. And so if that's what neighborhoods are flooded with, then of course we're seeing poorer health outcomes there. And then it's the same thing with those, deli corner stores as well. There's very little fresh produce. And also the other thing too, that sometimes you see, and actually it's interesting in my neighborhood, because I'm kind of on the border of a number of neighborhoods, on one side of the street, there's this very nice kind of American style bistro. And then on the other side of the street is a KFC, and there's a university in the area. And so then there's a grocery store that sells the most overpriced produce that you can ever purchase. You can spend $50 on fruit. And it's like, well, who is this neighborhood serving, right? Who can afford to not go to the KFC and to the grocery store? And so what ends up happening is that the folks that are in the housing project right up the street, well, they're going to the KFC and they're not going to the grocery store.
So what do we do about it? Here's, people listening are just like, oh my gosh, this is awful. I didn't realize that. So what do we as consumers do to try to change this paradigm? Because I think a lot of times we feel kind of helpless. We hear these problems and we're like, oh my gosh, that's awful. What can we do about it?
The truth is that this is all in the systems, right? So it's about who we vote into office. It's the laws that we support. It's, getting involved on the local level, going to your community board meetings and petitioning for shifts in neighborhoods. That's really what makes these changes. I think about something not food related, but, parking signs in New York, alternate parking. People in some neighborhoods have shifted how alternate side parking works in their neighborhood simply by going to community board meetings. And you can impact the same thing with, what grocery stores move in, also kind of what you require developers in urban settings to kind of incorporate into whatever buildings they have. And so I do think that, it is about getting involved on the systems level and really, voting kind of progressive, people-centered, you know, in that vein, in that shape. I think that that's what we have to do.
And in the end, it costs a lot less because when people get sick and they end up in a hospital or an ER and they might not have health insurance, we pay for that. The society pays for it. Plus, we don't want people to be unhealthy. They're not as productive. So in the end, when you're people-centered, it saves a lot of money. And some people only think about money. I mean, unfortunately, but I don't. I'm with you on that. Like you have to, kind of advocate from the ground up, right? From the neighborhood up. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's also about, individuals making a commitment to the larger community. And one of the things that we've all seen, over the last 10 months is that it's really hard for people to get past themselves, right? Like, it's not just thinking like what's good for me. It's also like what's good for my neighbor. And when we start to think as a collective, especially with regard to where do, playgrounds get built and where do bike lanes get, put in, and advocating for those types of things. So it's not just in neighborhoods that have higher incomes, but that it makes it all the way throughout the city. And I keep using my neighborhood as an example, but it's like, the bike lane stops 2 blocks from where my house is, because of course there's a shift in the demographic of the neighborhood. And so it's like, no, we've got to advocate for the collective, not just as ourselves, the individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. As we look to 2021 and where is, food and nutrition headed, you and I are talking about social justice. That's a big, broad issue. Looking at just individuals and the way they're going to be eating. I think nutrition certainly was in the spotlight this year because we all did realize like, if we eat a healthier diet, we might do better if we do get sick. But where is nutrition going? Because a lot of the stuff I'm reading is that it's all about the individual. You just talked about the collective, but now when it comes to nutrition and we look at our own bodies, how will people be eating this year? Do you see any sort of shift to people being much more mindful of their own bodies, but also the joy factor, because everybody's been sort of stuck at home, right? And it's like food brings joy. So where's it going in 2021?
So I always talk about individuals, right? Especially when it comes to nutrition and health. And I think that we will see different iterations of where nutrition is headed based on people's socioeconomic status, as well as their access to the variables that are needed for them to express their health. So one of the things that we said, Liz, just a moment ago is that, if you went into this pandemic disadvantaged, you're already going to be more disadvantaged. And so we know that there are more people now that are hungry than ever before in this country. So I think for people who are experiencing food insecurity, who are experiencing significant uncertainty with regard to housing and education, I think that nutrition will be a primary need, and it will be about something that's about sustaining yourself, right? And then that's a very different question than people who have a little bit more flexibility. And that's where I think we'll start to see a real focus on individualized protocols and individualized health and I think that that's where we'll see that. But I think across the board that in dietetics, there is the awareness, or it's starting to grow, that there is no one size that fits all. I think there is also the awareness of various cultural foodways, right? That there's not just one way to be healthy, and that, a salad is great, but a plate of greens is also fantastic with some hot sauce, right? That's awesome. You don't have to put the hot sauce on it, but you could. And so I think that will be a major shift that we see, where cultural foodways are taken into consideration, saying that, we all eat differently and there are many, many ways for us to be healthy. And then how do we make it sustainable for the person? How do we make it so that it helps that individual express their best health possible?
Mm. When you look at the cultural foodways, historically looking at the food pyramid and then my plate, it's very sort of American centric. America is a melting pot. I grew up in a Jewish household. We ate a certain way, but I would say we were more like a typical American diet. But how do you see like my plate? Because I know you're involved with it. I read it in the New York Times. So yeah. How do you see like my plate moving to be more mindful and sensitive to all these different cultural foodways and celebrating them versus demonizing them?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I think that it's on also kind of the practitioner. I think we'll see a shift in how people are educated. so that when we're thinking about starches, we can, include breadfruit, we can include plantain, we can include white rice, we can include brown rice, we can include quinoa, you know what I mean? So I think that we will start to see the way that foods are discussed shift. And if we're able to have a broader discussion, then that means that there's more space for all sorts of cultural foods and flavors. I also think if the shift moves away simply from BMI and the number on the scale to talking about health, that also broadens the conversation, right? Because part of foods getting demonized is because we're telling people to eat a specific way to have a specific number on the scale, when in fact we know weight may or may not be meaningful, right? Like it can have an impact and it can also not have an impact. But if we're focused on metabolic health, then the discussion shifts to what is it you, Liz, like to eat on a day-to-day, and how can we help that or help you fit that into a nutrition prescription that supports your health, rather than, Liz, you have to eat this way so that your BMI is this number.
Right. No, you make a good point. And I, true confession, through COVID, my intake of sweets has really gone up. I just have such a sweet tooth, and that's just one of the little, joyful things. I have a little ice cream every night, but that's fine, because I eat a ton of fruits and veggies and whole grains. I'm like, I am so over that. It's all good. It's all good. And I agree with what you say. You can't just look at the weight on the scale. You have to look at blood pressure and blood sugar, and there's different parameters. It's not just what you weigh, right? That's not the only parameter to look at.
Exactly. No, and I mean, I think the other thing, when we're thinking about, okay, how do I make my plate, or any plate for that matter, applicable to all of the patients that I work with, So I have people who are from religious backgrounds and they're, modern Orthodox. And then I have patients who are from Southeast Asia. And then I have patients who are from the American South and they're Black American. I also have patients who are from, the Creole speaking Caribbean. And with each of them, the conversation is, what are the foods that show up in your house on a regular basis? How do we think about the proportion of how they appear on the plate and the frequency of intake, regardless of what they are? And how does that impact you, the individual's overall health, right? How's your blood pressure as a result of X food, right? How are your blood sugars? And that's the conversation. That's how, I think as clinicians and practitioners that we can begin to shift the plate to the individual instead of, listen, you need to have a salad on half your plate and a piece of grilled chicken, and then brown rice. Well, that's not, some people don't recognize that type of eating as, their food way. Like I have patients who put me onto cholent and I was like, yes, this is the best thing on the planet.
Tell everybody what it is.
So, it's kind of a roast that goes in for a very long time, but you can add vegetables and onions, and usually it's consumed over Shabbos. And so, and that for me was a great learning experience.
What do you do though? People listening now, they're probably thinking, okay, I want to eat healthfully. I'm going to do this in the new year, but I have one child who's a vegetarian because they're very dialed into sustainability and climate change. And then my husband's got high blood pressure. So he's more on a DASH style diet. Is it humanly possible for a family to sit down and eat the same thing for dinner, but have that same thing really meet everybody's individual needs? Or is it best to start with basically the same and then just have like little tweaks along the way? How do you balance that? Because with all this individuality, that might be 4 people at a table wanting to eat something different.
Totally. Liz, I thought you were actually talking about my family when you were like, oh, I have a vegetarian who's like tuned in. I was like, oh yeah. And then you're like, and then the salt sensitive. I was like, wait a second, are you talking about my family?
How did she know this? Wait a second.
So, so I think that there are 2 things, right? So number one, I think there's the question of, are allergies present? Because if food allergies specifically, are not present, then there's a lot more leeway for what that base is. Because that can all, that adds a different layer. And so in my home, and this is what works for us, it may work for someone else and it might need modification for others. But in my home, basically we eat a vegetarian style, pattern of eating. That's a kind of how we consume. And meat will come in from time to time. but that is what we do. And that works for all of us. And because it's really based in a lot of plants, a lot of plants, then it works for the vegetarian child. It works for me, who's the person that's salt sensitive. And I use a ton of herbs and spices. So, my biological family is from the Caribbean. My dad is Haitian and my biological mom is from Trinidad and Tobago. And so, in my early years, actually, I was born in Massachusetts, but then I went back to Trinidad and Tobago and I was there, I think, for the first, 3-4 years of my life with my grandparents. And so I grew up eating very flavored foods, right? So and Trinidad is known for its influence, India. And so there are a lot of curries and a lot of chutneys, and there's roti and there's chickpea and there's dal. And so I grew up eating, those, it's my favorite types of food, those types of foods. And so I cook the same way now at home. So the other day I did chickpeas and some green, I didn't even remember what it was that I had. And then I just curried it, I will put cumin on my salad. We work with flavors so that the vegetables are delicious. It's there's, we don't miss anything. I play with coconut milk. We play with a lot of flavor, onion, garlic. And because there are no allergies, I can do that. There are no intolerances.
Right.
The only thing is the salt sensitivity. But that's really what we do, so that there's always kind of this base of vegetables. And I use all vegetables, right? So I'm not one of those people that's oh, we don't eat potatoes. No, we eat all vegetables.
Right. They all count. Yeah. Yeah.
They all count.
I was at the Stop and Shop this summer and I ran into a friend who's from Atlanta originally. She's Southern Belle. And she was buying a big can of collard greens. And I thought, oh, I'm going to buy a big can of collard greens too. She's like, oh, yeah, my collard greens. And you know where the can of collard greens is? It's still in my pantry. So Maya, I think you might have mentioned a big plate of greens. What shall I do with that big can of collard greens? Because darn it, I've got to use it up.
Right. So the first thing that I always do with anything that's in a can is I give it a good rinse. And also because it's been canned, it cooks so quickly. It's already been broken down. So it depends on the direction that you want to go with it. I perceive collards as sweet, but that's because I like very dirty greens. So I can eat dandelion greens and bitter greens with no issue. So for me, collards are sweet, where I recognize for some people, they're not super sweet. And for those, I say maybe a little bit of sweet onion, like a Vidalia onion, and a little bit of garlic to help with the sweetness. And then, this is some black pepper. Maybe you want to put some paprika in there to season it up. I love to put cumin on everything. Mm-hmm. I think it's my Caribbean roots. So I've always find myself putting cumin on collards. I know that that's not everyone's thing, but for sure, I love a hot pepper. Sometimes I'll put a slice of fresh jalapeno in there. I might even do a poblano pepper in there. And if you don't have those fresh things, a little Aleppo pepper or a red pepper flake can, take it to the limit. And for people who are not salt sensitive, you can go ahead and sprinkle a little bit of salt on there. That'll help break down some of the fibers also, even though it's pretty broken down from being in a can. But so that's kind of what I would do with collards.
Well, I will tag you on Instagram when I prepare those collard greens. Okay.
Okay. Absolutely.
I'll come up with something yummy. A couple more questions, and then I want you to tell everybody where to find you on social media, because I love following you on Instagram. But there's a few more things I wanted to ask you, because when I was looking at sort of the big macro trends, things we're going to be hearing a lot about and seeing in 2021, and you sort of touched on it a little bit before, but that is eating mindfully and intuitively. Mm-hmm. Maybe you didn't touch on it. Maybe I'm just thinking of an article I read where you were quoted. But when we hear these terms, eat mindfully, eat intuitively, is it the same thing? Can you define those terms? And why do you think that's a trend for 2021?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about, mindful eating, so the first thing, I want to go back and say one thing, is that when we're thinking about the ideas of mindful and intentional eating, sometimes people say well, that's not generalizable to the population, right? That's something that people who have the luxury to think about food in a specific way can engage in, and that it doesn't work across all socioeconomic statuses. And also, some people say that it is something that is an inherently white behavior, right? That it's not something that people of color can engage in. Part of that is tied into how diet culture functions, right? Is that it is this culture of food that is exclusive when food in general should not be exclusive, right? That everybody, food is something that we all engage in consuming. And so we really want, at least in my opinion, when I'm thinking about, making recommendations to people, and I talk to all people, right? So I'm talking to, people across cultures and across socioeconomic status. I'm thinking about things that people can engage in that do not cost money. And so I think to engage in mindful eating, right? To think about what somebody's eating and make a choice that is not linked to needing to lose weight. It's a choice that's linked to eating a food that can be nourishing and one that feels good. And also it's like, very specifically about saying like, I'm not eating this to fit into a certain diet. There is some privilege. We know it's unequivocal, right? Like we can't dispute it, right? There is some privilege around, having like the luxury to like kind of dream about food and think about it, especially if your primary needs are not met. And so I do think what we're starting to see across the board and across cultures is people are saying, if I don't take care of my health, no one's going to do it for me. And we're also seeing in communities of color where people are really saying, oh my goodness, the system is not here to support me. And so I'm really going to do it for myself. I'm going to make an intentional choice about what I put into my body. I read an article in the Times about so many people in Black American communities becoming vegetarian, turning toward a vegetarian style of eating, simply because we know that the numbers of non-communicable diseases are so high in communities of color, right? So there has been it's been around for a long time, but we're starting to see it discussed publicly. And we also know when we're looking at health outcomes, right, that what we eat can really change the trajectory of where a disease goes. And so I think that when we're thinking about mindful and intuitive eating, it's something that can work for different types of people and has to really be modified to fit the person, right? So it's like you can take parts of it, right? Because let's say you've got a shift job and you're working untenable hours. It's very hard to prioritize food because of what your schedule is. But you can say, okay, I want to bring X, Y, and Z foods with me to nourish myself when I have my break.
So that's mindful eating, because you're really thinking ahead and
Right.
how will that choice impact me? Mm-hmm.
Right. And the other part too of intuitive eating, right, is that you're really saying like you're not saying that these foods are good and these foods are bad, because that means that you can have ice cream and you can have a cake and you can have a cookie without the guilt, right? Because part of what happens in our culture across the board with food is we quantify it. You're a good person because you ate a salad. You're a bad person because you ate ice cream. That's why you got diabetes. None of that is true, right? You're not a bad person because you had ice cream, and eating ice cream didn't give you diabetes, right? So you can't simplify things and make it so black and white. And so part of intuitive eating is making choices that are against kind of these mainstream ideals of this is good food and that is bad food, to what are the foods that nourish me and what do I want to eat.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think probably this year I'll do a whole show on mindful eating, intuitive eating. There's some folks out there who do it and talk about it all the time. I personally, I eat because I like the flavor of the food. I eat because it makes me feel good. So I guess I do eat mindfully. It's a little touchy-feely personally for me, because I tend not to be that touchy-feely.
I love it.
But
it's hard. Listen, Liz, it's not easy. And I do think that it's really complicated. The other day I was out for a very long walk and I was thinking about nutrition. I was thinking about access to food. I was thinking about how we interact with food, who has, access to specific healthcare, what it means to be a person of color in this country. These are the things that, run through my head when I'm by myself. And there is no easy answer, right? And the truth is, like, I can talk about this as much as I want, but, for my patients who are living in East New York and, the closest store is a corner store that's making bacon, egg, and cheese, they can be as intentional and as mindful as they want, but the systems are set up so that they cannot achieve their best health possible.
Right, right. Yeah. So, even if like, as we all look ahead to, to the year and, 2020, whew, it's behind us. What would you say then are some little changes then, that regardless of your circumstance, where you live, your access to food, are there little changes, that we can all make this year so that our families are healthier, we're healthier, and our communities are healthier? Give us like a little call to action.
Absolutely. So the first thing that I say is not nutrition related, but it's actually around intentional movement is, to go outside. For me, this is a huge, huge thing. I know at the beginning of the pandemic, kind of, we were all told to, stay safer at home. But now, we know that being outside, having some sunlight in a safe way, masked up and properly distanced is really important, right? We need fresh air. And so, I encourage my patients to go outside daily if they can. That would be number one. The other thing I would say is, find your food style, find the things that you enjoy and think about a modification that you can make if it's needed for making it nourishing, but also health promoting, right? So, I have some patients who love juice, and so they drink a lot of juice. And then the question is, okay, well, so you're having, 24 ounces of juice a day. Is there a way that we can shift some of this behavior, right? Maybe we reduce the juice, maybe we change the type of juice, right? So looking at the patterns that you're already engaging in and thinking about how do we make it health forward. I think that that's quite important.
I like that. I like that, health forward. Do your kids eat a healthy diet? I was going to ask you this at the very beginning. My show, we used to talk a lot about picky eating, and I'd ask people, give me your best, picky eater pointer kind of thing. And so how, since you grew up in a household, I'm assuming you cook this way for your kids with lots of flavor.
Yeah.
Are they good eaters? How would you describe them?
So I think, neither of my children have any allergies. My son is a vegetarian, and he could live on rice and beans. He could live on tortillas and vegetables. He has said that there will be a point in his life where he eats seafood. And I love his older version of himself. He's like, yeah, I'm just going to eat rice, vegetables, and fish, and I'm going to live in the woods. And I was like, You are the sweetest child possible.
And how old is he?
He's 13.
That is just so funny that he's looking, but he won't eat fish now. He won't eat fish now. Okay. But in the future.
That's when he's older.
Okay.
Yeah, when he's older. That's that's going to be how he eats.
Mm-hmm.
He's very sweet. And my daughter is the child that refers to butter as cheese. And she often says, like, this cheese is delicious. And we're like, it's butter. And she's like, whatever it is, I love it. And, today she asked me to make her a sandwich that was basically butter, meat, and bread that we made. And she was like, this is excellent. And she asked for cucumbers on the side and some sliced apples. And so that's what she had. She's a serious carnivore. She's a real carnivore.
That is so funny. I was thinking you should slice the cucumber really thin, put it in the sandwich, and then she'll be like the, Queen Elizabeth eating her little tea sandwich with just the butter. Because my mother-in-law does this. It's like the bread with the butter, a slice of cucumber, and then I think the other piece of bread. It's just a little crunch, exactly. A little butter.
That's right. That sounds perfect. I mean, actually, now you've got me in my head. I'm like, ooh, a buttered radish with a little bit of salt would be excellent.
Very French, very French. Yeah, I think, do the DNA. I think your daughter might have just a little bit of the, a little British in her.
Well, actually, so here's the thing that's funny that you say that. My husband is Swiss. So that's where the love for butter and bread comes from, because the Germans and the Swiss, they're like real serious with their bread, butter, and meat. And, the Caribbean was colonized by the British. So there you go.
It's all coming together. And, and when you were talking about Indian food, I'm, obsessed with, you don't know this, but I'm obsessed with like Middle Eastern food and Israeli food because I love Yotam Ottolenghi. I talk about him on the podcast all the time, and he's from Israel, but I love all those flavors. And he'll take cumin seed and coriander seed, he'll toast them, and then he'll just crush them with a mortar and pestle. And I love those flavors. I'm just getting much more accustomed to them because I'm cooking a lot of his recipes. And I think it's fun to start to experiment with spices and herbs. And since we are not traveling, and at least for the foreseeable future, we can travel just through the food we put on our tables.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I always say, especially when people are talking about the Mediterranean diet, I'm like, don't forget there are 22 countries around the Mediterranean. So, Lebanese food, gets the same accolades and is incredibly delicious.
Right. And very different from Italian food. I think when we think the Mediterranean, we think Italy, Spain, Greece. There is so much more to it. Yeah, we could definitely start to kind of play and experiment. So do you have high hopes for 2021? What do you think? And as far as like the health of our country, do you think this whole pandemic will actually not just kind of shine a light on all the inequities out there, but lead to some change?
Well, I'm going to be hopeful for a moment. So I'm going to say that, I am hopeful that we will see some systemic shifts. I'm hopeful that, some of our elected officials will start to prioritize the lives and the health of, Black and brown bodies. I'm hopeful that, people who are more marginalized and disenfranchised will receive subsidies that they need. I'm hopeful that some of those changes will happen. I know that it takes work, right? I'm not just optimistic for the sake of optimism. And I know that it takes like a full intention and commitment to really, restructuring the system and thinking about it in a different way. Like I'm hopeful that our profession within the academy that we'll start to see some shifts, about bringing in, more dietitians of color, expanding the field so that, it's more inclusive of the types of patients that we serve so that we see practitioners from all backgrounds. I hope that that's the case. The truth is, a few days into 2021, it's not looking so great, that's the truth. Like, I mean, like I say over and over and over again, this is a cosmic shift. This is a moment that is like none other, and that there has been so much loss and so much pain. And so what I want for our nation and for the globe at large is for deep healing, and I know that for deep healing to happen, that change has to also come hand in hand.
Right. Yeah. And, and I keep getting back to like just this, like we have to celebrate our differences and really learn from each other. I just feel like even, I don't know, I'm going a little off topic here, but even on my blog, like, and I've done this and I need to like figure out how to undo it. Like I'll do recipes and I might say Asian salmon stir fry. Like I'll give a recipe a title, Asian salmon stir fry. And everyone's like, ooh, that sounds great. But it's almost the equivalent of somebody else, because I'm assuming you're not Jewish and I am Jewish, like you saying Jewish meatballs. I'd be like, well, why are you calling that recipe Jewish meatballs? You're not Jewish. And what do you know about Jewish meatballs? And then an Asian person might say, well, what do you mean Asian salmon stir fry? Well, what made that Asian? And the way to frame it would be ginger garlic salmon stir fry or whatever it might be.
Or whatever the region it's from.
Yeah, exactly. You can't just say like an entire,
Right.
Asian space.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. No, it totally is. I mean, there's a difference between Malaysian food. My friend who lives in Singapore eats very different than our friends who live in mainland China. So we have friends in Tokyo and there's, the way that they eat is also quite different. So, yeah, I mean, I think that that's the other thing that we can do, is to really just name the things that we're engaging in. And that's also part of how we ended up here, right? Like there was this fear of saying like, oh, this is the type of food that, Black American people eat, or this is the type of food that people eat in the Northeast. Everybody knows that if you live or grew up in Massachusetts, probably some type of seafood was a major part of like you're growing up, right? Like everyone knows Maine is known for their lobsters, and we feel fine to name those things. But when it comes to what's happening in Black and brown communities, we're so fearful of it, right? We don't want to say what's going on. And it's like, no, we have to name the excellence. We have to name the injustice. We have to name it all so that we can move through.
Right, right. And like you said, if this is your diet, how do you make some small changes so you still enjoy it, but it's a little bit healthier? Health forward. I like
That's
that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of work to be done, a lot of mindfulness at all levels. For me, it's just even learning as a recipe developer, how to name things in a way that's appropriate. So
right.
Lots to learn and lots of goals. So I'm hopeful for 2021 as well. And I loved what you said before about the article you read about Black Americans engaging a little bit more in vegetarian diets. And it's like, yeah, it's not exclusive to certain people. Everybody, it's a healthy way of eating. Why not? Yeah.
That's absolutely right. That's totally right.
Yeah. So Maya, where can people find you on social media and online? And I know you have a cookbook too, and we should have talked about that at the beginning. So tell us about your cookbook and where people can find you.
Oh, yeah. So the cookbook is the Southern Comfort Food Diabetes Cookbook. And people say, yeah, but you're not, from the American South. And I'm like, no, I'm from the South, like the Caribbean.
I'm from the real South.
The South. So, the cookbook has a number of recipes that are diabetes friendly. And I really weave in kind of foods from across the diaspora. So, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and the American South. I really do believe that like Southern cuisine is like the ultimate American food, and it is really based in like everything that's good because the agricultural South is incredible. So the cookbook it's great for people who have diabetes or people who are trying to think about managing their blood sugars. I will be working on another cookbook coming out this year. Or not coming out this year, but this year. So that's going to be quite exciting.
Is it top secret?
So it's really funny because it was announced on the Penguin Random House site. Someone sent it to me and they're like, I didn't know. And I was like, yeah. So I'm working on it. Yes. And to find me on social, I'm across social, Maya Feller RD. And my website is mayafellernutrition.com.
Great. And where'd you go to college, by the way? See, I should have asked you all this at the beginning.
Oh, yeah. So I went to NYU for my undergrad and my grad.
My mother went to NYU for home economics.
Oh, my goodness. I love it.
Yep, back in the 50s. And she's got some interesting stories. I think as part of it, she had to live in this apartment with other home economics majors, these other ladies. And they had a woman who was sort of like the headmistress of the household. And you had to have certain manners. And yeah, it's a whole different time.
Incredible. I love it. I love it.
And she was a home ec teacher and a very good cook. And so that was probably what led me to get into cooking and nutrition. So there you have it. Home ec through and through. Home ec through and through. Yep.
Bring back home ec.
Yes. Oh, we should. Oh my gosh. That's a whole nother topic. Well, Maya, thank you so much for joining the show and just kind of opening our minds to thinking about food and nutrition from a really different lens and perspective. And I think that's really important.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for having me. And it's been, wonderful talking to your audience. And I'm just so glad to have the space and the time to be in conversation with you today.
Great. And so thanks so much and good luck with that cookbook. You'll come back on when the new cookbook's out, I hope.
Absolutely.
Okay. And thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in today as we kick off 2021. It's got to be a good year. If you love the show, tell a friend about it. Post a review on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, wherever you get your podcasts. Check out the show notes. I'll give you links over to Maya's website and her social media. And as always, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.